Good morning, everybody. This is Dana B. and Charlie A. And we're with Larry Johnson, the Liberty Man. As you all know, we are part of the 3%, better known as Mountain Patriots Educational Ministries. We've been doing this now for the last 4 years, and we want to make sure that people understand what's going on, especially today in the world. But we have the opportunity right now, since this is our 250th anniversary coming up on July 4th, of 2026, we have the 250th anniversary, and Larry and Charlie and I got together, and Larry wanted to make sure that the history of this great country from his standpoint was able to be recorded and shared for posterity down through the generations. We want people to understand what sacrifices were made, how important this country is, and what most people don't understand is what people actually lived through as the Revolutionary War, or it was better known back then as the Glorious Cause, actually came about and actually happened. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our incredible commentator and leader, Charlie Marker. You know, who is that? So we're going to have a little bit of fun with this, and we're going to get some great history today with the Liberty Man. Charlie?
Yeah, thank you, Dana, and thank you, Larry, for bringing Liberty Man again to our front and center and sharing with us what's going on. A couple of things that we'd like you to elaborate on, if you would. One is, how did you come about doing this particular program? You put it together, and you've done it for people in the past in live settings. What brought you to make this? And then tell us a little bit about the Backwoods Boys weapons and a little bit of, I understand you have a couple things to show us. So Larry, if you would, please.
Well, Charlie and Dana, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and share with you history. I don't know if you will say, like I said 10 or 12 years ago, that here is some history that I discovered for myself that I did not know. And I grew up among the people that lived this history out. And the details, of course, were passed on piecemeal, but nothing really from parents, grandparents, great-grandparents to children in a way that we really could embrace it and understand it and know it. And of course, I'd like to say that I grew up right here. You'll see in the slide presentation at the very end, you'll see a field that I've worked in, the same fields that my ancestors that fought in the American Revolution tended those very fields. So I guess you could say the apple does not fall very far from the tree, which I'm very pleased with. So this came about simply because I wanted to know more of the history about the men and women that my family fought with, and they were not Continental soldiers. And you'll understand more about the Continental soldier and the difference between the Continental soldier and the militiaman as this program unfolds. But these were boys and men that were not much involved in the revolution up in New England. And I will get into that as the program unfolds here. But as the British moved south, they became more involved because for the first time in their life, they saw British soldiers. For the first time in their life, they began to have to deal with judges who were really English judges, very unfair. And so things had to change. And so the Committee of Correspondence, which was like the legislature, the early legislature assemblies in those days, the Committee of Correspondence really determined what the law was going to be. And it was the new form of government, even before the governor's king had been run out of the state. And he was run out. He had to escape for his life, and he got on an English ship, and he tried to govern from a ship out in the ocean. And of course, it did not work. So with that background, I'd like to point out the implements of war that our boys that our boys had to come up with themselves. And if you have any questions, just stop me. I mean, this is
Sure.
not a, I
Will do.
hope this is the discussion.
Yes.
Yeah. So, first of all, there was the musket, which I'm not, well, you can't see it from here, but there is a musket that I showed in the last program sitting over just and this would be the family musket that a young boy took to war with him. Another thing he took to war with him, if they had a mule or not, well, mules weren't here then, had a horse, that he would take the family horse for this very purpose, that if he had a horse and he had a sword, he could come to 30 days early. And if he had a horse, he got an extra $5 a month for the horse. So they took what they had at home. The families supported them, and we'll come back to that in a very strong way later. But the uniform of the Backwoods Boys, you might think of it as a blue uniform with a tricorn with trim on it. But you'll hear me point out that the clothing of the Backwoods Boy was usually, his outer garment was this, which is a hunting jacket or a hunting shirt. They would take ashes, charcoal, and they would put inscriptions on it. I don't know if you can read that or not, but this has liberty or death.
Liberty or death.
And other things they would put on their hunting shirts would be, and we will talk about what this is made out of in the program. Other things they would put on would be, this is liberty or death. They would put, believe it or not, Congress, right? Congress, because that meant the people were going to rule in a new Congress. And they would put it on, if they had a hat that they could put it on, they would, and they got, sometimes they would tear pages out of hymn books, and they would put it on their tricorn, stick it right in here, and they'd put some kind of slogan on it. However, they stopped doing that because if it was white, it made a target, and you could see it at night. So they would just use it for cartridge making.
Makes sense.
So the things they wanted a musket. They tried to have a musket. This is a butcher knife. You might think of a butcher knife being much larger. This is a butcher knife. They would make themselves a knife, and it's extremely sharp. You can shave with it. That would be for skinning animals and skinning people. They'd want a sword, and you'll see in the program and hear in the program about the making of swords. And then the other thing you don't hear about in my presentation today so much, not the making of a tomahawk, because families usually had a sufficient number of tomahawks. Now, why would that be? I can tell you, because they had confiscated them from Indians that were attacking. They had them, dad or grandfather had them left over from the French and Indian War. The style of this, and I don't know if you can see it with the small picture, the style of this is a curved head on the tomahawk. This tomahawk was a French tomahawk. So what does that tell you? It would have been taken from a Frenchman, and it was designed by a Jesuit priest, and it was in a curve here. And the purpose of it was for throwing it. And one of the things that they practiced on a regular basis was throwing the tomahawk so that if someone was trying to get away, you could stop them. And then, of course, we actually have talked about the sword, and we'll talk more about the sword. They needed a sword if they were going to be in the horse. And then the other thing, when they killed or imprisoned a Scotsman, there wasn't much they could do with the broadsword because the broadsword was so long. The Scotsmen, as you probably know, carried that on their back in Scotland. Maybe that's one reason they kept losing wars over there. They couldn't wield the broadsword. But one thing that our boys liked to get was this dirk. And the Scotsman carried it in his sock. And you see the size of a dirk and the size of a butcher knife that they would make it in the blacksmith shop is about the same size. And the information that I've read, and this is sort of brutal, is that many of the people use that for not only skinning animals, but scalping their victims. I've read nothing that any of the Backwoods Boys were involved in scalping. I have read about a character that you will become acquainted with in our story, is that this man named Fanning. His people they were brutal. They were in support of the king. They were the king's men. Sounds like a singing group. But they were the king's men, and they were absolutely heartless. This is the untold story of men who could be the most misunderstood and controversial soldiers in American history. They were called scum by civilized society. They were called scum by civilized society and a pack of beggars. This is the untold story of men who could be the most misunderstood and controversial soldiers in American history. They were called scum by civilized society, by the society of the time, and they were called a pack of beggars by distinguished politicians, especially in South Carolina. They were belligerent, they were bigoted, they were tough, they were valiant, according to one of the most important Southern historians. And what's worse, their own generals did not trust them because they were so unruly and almost impossible to command. The Backwoods Boys lived beyond the clothed society of the Rice Kings in South Carolina and the aristocrats of the coastal plains. They lived on the edge of large plantations near the Blue Ridge, near the Allegheny Mountains, South Carolina, and even down into Georgia. This is where they operated for the most part. The center of this operation is not exactly perfect, but the center of the operation is where they begin to function as a group of backwoodsmen that were organized to fight. They were organized to fight by some generals that you will meet in just a little bit, and the big battles they fought that are in the history books are battles that are in Guilford, at Greensboro, and also at Cowpens. Determining how many boys fought is next to impossible to calculate. During the Revolution, 22,000 North Carolinians became soldiers, so says the North Carolina Daughters of the American Revolution. American Army of 100,000. Now, for those of you here in Virginia, or you are here in Virginia and you're part of the program, you're probably going to wonder where the figures are for Virginia. Well, they're somewhere in Virginia, but the Daughters of the American Revolution begin right after World War I to gather these information. Okay? I wish this was so that everybody could have this map on their bulletin board at home. But we'll do the best we can. There were 22,000 boys that fought. The American Army never consisted of more than 100,000 at any one time. So you can see there was a heavy number of these poor boys, let's say, who had come with their horses and come to fight. This comprised fully 1/5 of the total fighting force of the American Army. Many of the boys And this is based on applications that were submitted after the war for pensions. And there probably might have been even more because many of the boys had died before the news of Congress passing the Pension Act reached the backwoods. Two, and get this, some just didn't want to go through the hassle of dealing with the federal government, so they didn't apply.
Imagine that.
Another thing was rosters were not accurately kept by the commanders who were too busy fighting. Literacy of some of the commanders played an important part. And yes, some of the boys did not want to confront magistrates of law because they had such bad experiences confronting judges under a king. So could they actually trust the new government? The new government had to prove itself. Many of their compatriots were dead already, so they couldn't come to the judge's office or the county seat to vouch that their friend or their buddy had been a part of the American Revolution. All of this is not to be minimized, but it is a part of the mystery of the American Revolution. And you asked earlier, why did I get into this? I wanted to know about the mystery of the revolution, the unnamed men and women that fought for our freedoms, because their story is absolutely magnificent. And I hope that you will find some of this in our presentation today. Both friend and foe had opinions about the Backwoods Boys. Next slide.
I'm getting there. It's having fun with us, Larry.
Okay. We're all learning. This is an attack at Chin's plantation house. The painting is by Howard Pyle. If you really want the greatest artwork ever done, it is by Howard Pyle.
That's fascinating.
Books, and I recommend this to homeschool parents to get copies of his books, which are out of copyright but are still available. The challenge of the boys was they were fearless, they did not give up, and they would attack the enemy on a moment's notice, even though they were called scum, pack of beggars, they were called worthless, they were called ignorant, they were called mean, they were called white savages. The enemy hated them, and even polite society hated them. Now, at Waxhaw's, I'll mention this governor. He went to 2 continental conventions. He was governor of South Carolina several times. He was a commanding general in the South Carolina forces, and he was made a member of the Supreme Court, and he's one of the ones that hated these dirty, stinking boys that he thought could not be trusted. I hope before he left this earth, he learned something. This man's name is John Rutledge, governor of the colony of South Carolina, and also all the other things that I mentioned. Now, at Waxhaw's, one of the bloodiest events of the American Civil War, Colonel Bannister Tarleton, Cornwallis's British cavalry officer, would saber to death and allow his men to kill 113 colonial soldiers, militiamen under Abraham Buford, who were trying to surrender, were holding up their hands, were sticking their bayonets in the ground as a symbol of I surrender. And Bannister allowed his men to continue to mutilate these men.
Wow.
And they ran among them with their swords. And as the men held up their arms, our men, they whacked their arms off. They whacked their heads off if they could get to those. Finally, some decency prevailed, but out of that group of about 225 soldiers in that unit, 113 were killed. 150 were seriously injured. They were so injured that many of them could not be taken prisoner and would eventually die. Bloody Band, as he became known, saw American forces, especially the militia, as easy targets. They would come to know their mortal foes in a very special way, not far away, at Hannah's cow pens on January the 21st, 1781, where the boys were led by General Daniel Morgan.
There's a name for us.
They were placed, Daniel Morgan knew the boys. He would place them in the first line to confront Tarleton's cavalry as they came up the little embankment at the cow pen, and they began to attack. What the strategy was there, Morgan would put them in the first line at a fence line, and then told them to fire twice and retreat. And that first fence line was comprised most of the North Carolina militia boys. And he knew that they would fire and run like heck. So he took advantage of that. And he told them they could. Give me 2 fires, and then you can leave. You can run. And the soldiers went to the woods, got their horses, and took off. Now that left the Continentals in the second line. And this is not a military strategy class, but it's a good class to study. And you can go to the next slide here.
Larry, let me ask you, how old were these kids that were fighting and being able to run 2 shots and then run?
From 12 to 17 years old.
Wow.
Now, there were some old men.
Right.
My great-great-great-grandfather was there. He was Abel Johnston's father, and he had several other sons that were there to fight as well.
Now, didn't you say that you had like 23 uncles that were there?
I have, I think it's 23. I'd have to go back and count again. It's about 23 uncles and 7 great-great-great-grandfathers that fought in the American Revolution.
See, that tells people just how important this was and what it meant. The sacrifice.
Well, it was a wake-up call for me late in life. And
wow.
thus the reason for digging into this, because as I dug into the history of the Continental soldier, I couldn't find it fit where my family fought. They were in the militia. They were guerrillas. They were inducted by the Marine Corps in the first on-land Marine Corps battle in the United States. The first battle of the Marines was down in the Caribbean. The second battle was near Abel's home, and all the boys were inducted. I don't think they were trained as Marines. They just happened to get inducted into the Marine Corps. So, as we move on here, Bloody Band, as they call Tarleton, Bloody Band saw all the American forces as easy targets. They weren't well trained. And of course, this is where Morgan took advantage of his actual lack of information, lack of technical information. And so when he sent his troops up the hill, the boys at the first line fired and then ran like heck up the hill. And Abel and his family had a horse, and they were in the cavalry, and they were on the ends of the line. And as the British ran up the hill, going to the second line where the Virginians were, the cavalry came in behind and whacked them to death. And before just almost seconds, British soldiers threw their hands up in surrender. There were 110 of Tarleton's men that were killed that day.
Wow.
There were 212 that were captured. Morgan lost only 27 killed. And of course, the story we know is Tarleton ran like heck. He took off. He ran as far away as he could possibly get, not taking any men with him, or even staying with his men. He fled, and in my opinion, he was a coward.
Yeah, I agree with you there. This is the
Okay.
same Tarleton that was cutting people's heads off and arms off that were surrendering.
Well, this became a problem, and I'm digressing now. This became a problem with our boys because when the word got out, our officers had to restrain, work hard, order our men not to give the same measure.
That makes sense.
Pardon?
That makes sense. I mean, you look, think of the rage that you're thinking when something like that happens to your own people.
Well, the battle cry in the next battles and at Guilford Courthouse, which happened only 2-3 months later, the battle cry with the boys coming up the hill to attack Cornwallis's troops there in the flat, which we'll see that picture later on at the end of the program, is they were shouting as they waved their swords and charging, they were shouting, Tarleton's quarter. In other words, take no prisoners. And our officers had been ordered by their commanding officer, Nathaniel Greene, not to engage in that type of slaughter. So it's why he had to work so hard to restrain our boys, because many of our boys, like my family, they were involved in some of these battles, and they saw it with their own eyes. So there you have a part of history that you won't read in a history book. But in my book called Liberty Man, I even have pictures of that place where those boys that got slaughtered were buried. Some of them were so mutilated, they just picked up parts and put them in a pile and put stones on top of them. And that's where they're buried today. And now that is a stone monument that people visit. I guess it's a tourist attraction. Okay, so we have Cornwallis here. After this battle at Guilford Courthouse, Cornwallis said the Americans there fought like, what did he say? There's a quote here. He'd never seen such fighting in all his days. And that battle was on March the 15th, 1781. Never seen men so willing to fight. They had just come away from a slaughter of Buford's men. I've never seen such fighting since God made me. The Americans fought like demons. However, some of our boys saddled up and left the field. In other words, some of their boys, those British soldiers in the red uniforms and the flashing swords, they saw such fighting, they escaped the field if they could, but Cornwallis could not break them up from fighting. In other words, if you're fighting with a guy and you want to quit and he doesn't want to quit, if you quit, you're dead.
Right.
So,
wow.
So Cornwallis said, we're going to lose this battle if this fighting goes on, because there are more of the Backwoods Boys that are showing up by horse because they're jumping into the fight. And so Cornwallis turns to his officer in charge of the cannons, the artillery. He says, train your artillery on the center of the field. And the officer said, they're still fighting. Cornwallis says, I know. It's the only way we're going to escape here and win the battle is that if we stop the fighting on the field and quit feeding the fighting with our men. So he ordered the captain of the artillery to fire, and he fired.
So Larry, so he fired at his soldiers as well as.
Yes. And he killed as many of his own men as he did the Backwoods Boys and our Continental forces. Our Continental forces were there, and the thing is, Continental forces had been lined up in the rear. Our boys were down, the country boys were down on the line. That would be the first to be engaged. And of course, the thing that they were trying to do, they were trying to get the heck out of there. They weren't trained in that kind of fighting. And their horses They had tied them, and I've been to that place, and there is a picture in this slide presentation of those woods. They tied their horses. They tied their horses on trees so that when they finished doing what they were supposed to do, the same thing that Morgan told them to do, which is, Morgan gave the strategy. He wrote a letter to Nathaniel Greene, and he says, try this strategy. Morgan wanted to go home. His sciatica was so bad he couldn't even sit in a saddle. He started, can you imagine riding all the way from North Carolina to Winchester with sciatica?
No.
I can imagine.
No.
I know what it's like. I've been there.
I know what it's like to get to the car with sciatica.
Right.
Right.
I used to be able to identify every pothole in Winchester when I had sciatica. Okay. Now we need to move the slide. We'll move from General Cornwallis and his famous quote that we all use to picture a young officer in his 30s, young 30s, that Washington had wanted to be his commanding general from the time he set up the Southern strategy. Now, we have to talk about a strategy. There was the Northern strategy where Washington was holding the British Army, the bulk of the army, in abeyance in New England, Philadelphia, New York, all the places up there, New Jersey. And he needed someone south. Now, there's another history here I can't get into, but every general that the Continental Congress selected was a failure, and picked over the objection of George Washington. I don't have time to go into their names here, but they're names that we would all know and love. But they were failures. They came back later. And tried to create a cabal to get rid of Washington. But that's another history. So finally, this young Quaker who had been placed in charge of gathering supplies was the last man left, and the Continental Congress says, okay, if you want to appoint a Quaker, a cripple, Nathaniel was a cripple. His daddy ran an iron forging business, making anchors and all sorts of things, and something fell on this kid and crippled him for life. As a matter of fact, the local forces in his village, that local defense forces, would not even allow him to join. They finally allowed him to join as a private, but he left and he went away to join the Revolutionary War. That's in its history now. His whole life should be studied. So anyway, Nathaniel Greene, and Washington used him and his expertise to become the gatherer of supplies. And he gathered the supplies and kept a starving army from starving to death. And Washington said, this is my man. And after several failures in the South, he asked the Continental Congress to appoint Nathaniel Greene to be his commanding officer in the South, in the Southern theater, to combat the English Southern strategy, which is another story. So there was a Northern theater commanded and managed by Washington, and there was a Southern theater. No, this is a wonderful painting of Nathaniel Greene, speaking of him, instructing the boys at Guilford Courthouse, instructing that they are to give 2 fires and then they can run. Next slide.
So, Larry, this is a general that was put in as a private, was a cripple, and went to war, and no matter how much he hurt, he kept going to save this, to win this nation.
You're right. What a story. What an
What
untold
a story. That's a story in itself.
Every child needs to hear the story, needs to hear the story of this young man,
Right.
injured at early in life, who wanted to be a soldier, was turned down. And the Continental Congress had some question about him because he was a Quaker. They said Quakers don't fight. Well, this was a fighting Quaker. And they disowned him. I don't know what, they excommunicated him. Well, they can put that feather in their hat, like they can put that feather in the hat. They wouldn't feed our forces at Valley Forge for the first 2 or 3 months.
That's the Quakers, correct?
That's the Quakers.
Right.
Now, I got friends that are Quakers. Now, this is a map that's in our program. I hope this becomes a book someday. But this is a strategy map of Guilford Courthouse. And this map was drawn by Bannister Tarleton after he went back to England and retired. And you know that Bannister Tarleton never made general because of his brutality and at the surrender of Washington at Yorktown that night, the first night or two, the various generals and officers get together, and the winning general sponsors a banquet for the losers. Cornwallis would not allow Bannister Tarleton to come to the celebration banquet. Why?
This is the same guy that ran too, isn't it?
He ran, he fled, he killed soldiers, let his men kill soldiers that were trying to surrender.
Wow.
But he would not get rid of him because he was a fierce warrior. Okay, let's move on here. Next slide up. You can't see this, and I apologize, but this is an early drawing here. This is an early drawing here of Guilford Courthouse. And when we turn this into a book, children will love this because this shows the British forces over to the left. The first line is the North Carolina militia. Behind them are who? The Virginians, trained to fight, who would not budge under attack. Now, Virginia needs to take that and teach it to our children. If you're a Virginian, you don't move. You don't give up. You don't give way. But I don't know if I've ever heard a teacher in school teach this story. Okay, let's move on here. The story of the boys fighting at Guilford Courthouse. The fighting at Guilford Courthouse confirms our commander's concerns relative to using militiamen. After Guilford Courthouse battle, casualties were reported by Greene, his adjutant, and he said there were 79 Americans killed, 85 wounded, and get this, missing. Now, who would the missing be? I'll tell you. It was the Backwoods Boys who went in, they fired their shots, they tied their horses in the woods, and they went home. They did what you asked them to do and said, that's it. Call us if you need us. I think I'm adding that part, call us as you need us. But they would always come back to fight. So they went home. After all they served short tours, and they would return home to their families and to their crops to be cared for. British Army losses were this: 96 killed, 500 wounded. We only had 185 that were wounded. The British had 500 wounded. So you can see why Cornwallis says, after the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, he simply says, I shall seek no more adventures in North Carolina. And he headed his army to Wilmington to resupply because that was a port. Go next slide.
And these are kids that are 12 to 17.
That's who went to fight. In the cases where now, as the war ground on, Abel at the end of the war was about 24 to 26 years old. But when he started 8 years before, you see, but he stayed with it. Next slide. This is just an artist's depiction of our boys, no uniforms. This is when we do our book, this is a sketch of all the uniforms that a person did of the boys at Guilford Courthouse. And you can see there, the uniforms aren't glistening. They're full of holes. Some of them have regular Continental uniforms. You see a cavalryman in a cavalryman's outfit with a metal or strong leather cap on. And then you see other soldiers there with nothing, like Abel would have had nothing. Next slide. I put this in as of interest, personal choice here. This over to the left is one of our horse who had a uniform, probably fighting under Colonel William Washington, the second cousin of George Washington. He did get a chance to dress his men in some cavalry uniforms. So you can see they are not the customary colors of red or green or blue. They're more of a khaki colored. The picture to the right is a picture I took. I visited the battlefield, and this is the stream where the cavalry or the horse would have watered its animals either before or after the battle, probably before the battle. Okay, next slide. These are our forces lined up to fight. This is a piece of artwork that is at the War College up in Pennsylvania. I'm sure Charlie knows the name of the town up there. But there's a War College in Pennsylvania, and this is a mural that hangs on their wall showing probably the best depiction of our Continental forces that I've ever seen in all the books. You see a mix between uniforms, and you see the officer behind them urging them on, fight, and give it their last shot. Next slide. I wanted to put this, this is a picture of where the boys tied their horses. That's an interesting little picture. And by the way, the boys tied bells on their horses. Do you know why they tied a bell on their horse? I'll tell you.
So they could feed?
They tied a bell on the horse in case somebody wanted to steal their horse. It was one of our first burglar alarms. So the bell would ring. And there I'm holding a picture of this flag here, which is right here in front of me. That is the flag of these Backwoods Boys, the North Carolina militia, that they made their own flag. Obviously, they did not know what the Continental Congress had ordered, so they made their own banner. Because you need a banner to assemble. You know, on the battlefield, you need a point and a place to assemble, and you want a flag that identifies your unit. And so they did this flag to identify their unit. And the last time it was flown in public was before World War I at the grave of the first governor and the first general of North Carolina forces, Richard Caswell. Okay, next slide. You can't read all this, I'm sure, but basically what it is, it's Cornwallis's quote, and that's the battlefield right there. And there are stories and books that are written by men that were fighting hand to hand in that battle and survived it. And they talk about they talk about how hard it was fighting and how the other people would not give up. And when they fired the cannon, most of them went down, and the ones that did not go down, they just turned and walked away from their adversary. Greene wrote, when he wrote to Washington about the outcome of this battle, he said this, and this is a famous quote in Revolutionary War history. "It was long, obstinate, and bloody." Cornwallis said, "I never saw such fighting since God made me. The Americans fought like demons." And this is Jim Johnson. This is Jim Johnson standing where his grandfather Abel swung around as a part of the horse to engage in hand-to-hand combat. And the cavalry or the horse did not fight with long swords. This sword here may be too long for a cavalryman to fight with. They fought with shorter swords so they could leap off and plunge and cut. Now, that doesn't say they didn't have them. And their muskets were cut off. The muskets had short barrels. Now, why is this? Now, some of you horsemen know, don't you? That is so that when you are on horseback and fighting from horseback with a loaded musket, your musket is a short barrel, and you can swing it over the horse's neck or head to the other side as needed. And you're going to be in close hand-to-hand combat, so you're not taking aim or taking target. What you're doing, it's taking advantage of being on horseback and having a shorter barrel weapon to swing back and forth. Next
Great
slide.
illustration about, so that's part of the training, right?
Well, this is why I did this story. This is why I've done the story. I don't know if I'll ever live long enough to put it into a book, but it is what it is here now. The next slide, please. You can't see all this inscription unless you're in a room with a big screen. But Greene left the field, and it was at best a draw. Cornwallis reported that he won to his commanding officers in New York because he needed to get more supplies, and you losing army doesn't get more supplies. But it was a draw. It was a draw. He went to Wilmington because he had no supplies and there was a port down there. And guess what happened when he got to Wilmington? All the supplies had been wiped out. He barely could get back up to the ports in Virginia, and his army was starving. These two monuments that you see here, one honors Colonel Washington and Light Horse Harry Lee's troops. And this is where they assembled near that creek when they swung around as a part of the double envelopment strategy.
And this is Colonel William Washington, his second cousin, George's second cousin.
Second cousin. Second cousin. Right. And he had been sent south for some reason. I do not know why. It's probably an answer to that in some of the voluminous writing of Washington. Wrote all the time. He wrote all the time. And he had secretaries that copied like a copy machine, sit around in his fort or his headquarters tent, and copied his writings. Now, this story here is not a happy story, and I would not tell it to a group of children. But now the boys, the Backwoods Boys, people that lived in my community, which is now Harnett County, it was Johnston County then, and Cumberland County. I would like to tell the story about the naming of Cumberland County by the king, but that's another story for another day. So the boys were coming home from Okay, you know where Greensboro is about in the center of the upper part of the state. And that's where the Guilford Courthouse battle took place. It's about 100 miles from there to where my family lived and where these boys wanted to come back to, where their farms were. And so they traveled in small groups. If they could get a wagon, they'd travel in a wagon. If not, they'd travel in horses. Well, they got nearly home, about one night away from home, near what is now Lillington, the county seat of Harnett County. But they got to a road over there that's called Morgan's Road. And there's a bunch of many pine trees in North Carolina, huge pines. So they went over into the midst of a pine forest with lots of needles where you can lay down at night and sleep on the dirt. And 8 or 9 of them, that's where they stopped before they were going to go home the next day. And while they were asleep, a man named Fanning's soldiers, they were British militia, we'll call them that, organized by Daniel Fanning, who lived in that area and hated all his neighbors. But he was charismatic and he could organize the loyalists.
The loyalists meaning those still loyal to Britain.
Right.
Right. And so while these men were sleeping, they take their muskets and they fire into the bedrolls, hitting most of them, killing most of them instantly. And those that they missed and didn't kill, they ran them down and shot them to death. There was a boy sleeping in the wagon, and it woke him up. And he wakes up and he starts shouting, screaming. And then he starts shouting, "Parole, parole, parole." And one of the Scots Highlanders, as a part of Fanning's militia, takes his broadsword over and splits his head open to the shoulders. That's recorded. I've got it. I've got it in an old man's book that's dead now that I knew when I was a boy. He had all these notes. That was the slaughter at Piney Bottom. Piney Bottom is just a wide place in the road with a lot of pine trees. Matter of fact, my family owned a huge old plantation over there, and I used to pick cotton and prime tobacco near there. Well, anyways, the Piney Bottom. The word got out. The word got out to our guys who were already back, maybe from Guilford Courthouse, and there were hundreds of them in that area. They formed a posse, and this posse was led by the commander of Abel Johnston and all my family. Now, there's no word whatsoever that my family was involved in this next act. But he organized a unit, and they just went out to the first houses they found where there were Scots that were supporting the king, captured, took them to an opening, and he hung 7 of them.
Wow.
That was revenge.
Yeah.
Now, the Piney Bottom slaughter and the Scots massacre, you will find it hard to locate this history. You will have to look long and hard into a man's book named Hairr, Hairr. And then you'll have to look into a retired reserve officer, 40 years in the 82nd Airborne at Fort Bragg, and he has spent his life recording the battles in North Carolina, and there were hundreds of them. And I've got 2 copies of his books. There's a third one his wife said was out of print, and I think he may have died, so I won't probably never have that third book as my own. But this is what happened. Now, maybe this is too brutal to tell your children. I don't know.
It's history, Larry. I mean, you know this stuff like the back of your hand, and people don't appreciate what they don't know.
Well, they don't appreciate the sacrifice.
No, they don't.
And it would be probably in modern day society would be condemned, is that we should have never allowed that. They should have taken a breath, and they should have not done that. They should have arrested them and taken them to a judge, and da 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 da. And of course, there was no courts, no judges, no nothing.
All the courts then were British, or
And
there weren't. I guess the courts were in Britain, weren't they? So if you had to go to court, you'd have to go to Britain.
You had judges that were appointed by the king to do certain things, usually related to collection of taxes, and then appointing officials like tax collectors that got tarred and feathered. Now, the
kind of
swamp
sounds
fox.
like today.
Pardon? Yeah,
It
right.
sounds like today, doesn't it, Larry?
Yep.
Yep.
Now, this is legend. All right.
Okay.
I point this out strong and hard. This is legend. There is no definitive information that the swamp fox had a hand in this slaughter. But we do know that on occasions he traveled north as far up as Piney Bottom, because he traveled north getting away from the British down south. And this is all a part now of the Fort Bragg Reservation. So the word is that the swamp fox operated from time to time in and around what is now Fort Bragg.
Now, what is the swamp fox, Larry? What is the swamp fox?
Francis Marion.
Okay.
Francis
Now-
Marion.
Now, who's Francis Marion?
Francis Marion was a part of the battle with the British. He had joined the war. They had burned out. So Swamp Fox, Francis Marion, is the model for the lead character in The Patriot.
Aha.
Okay, the movie Patriot.
And people should watch that movie.
He's the model. Now that movie was adapted to sell tickets. And that movie is a blending of Cowpens and Guilford Courthouse. But Francis Marion was the character, the model for the lead character in the movie The Patriot. Now, he wasn't a real Hollywood pick, because he was not more than about 5'2" or 5'3". He was sick as a child. He became paralyzed, thinking he'd never walk again, but he did. And they said that he rode in the saddle because of his incapacitation, and he never walked without a limp. One of his knees was deformed. And so that's the swamp fox. We don't know.
Do you know how he got the name Swamp Fox, Larry?
Swamp fox is Francis Marion.
Yeah, but how did he get that name? Do you know?
He fought in the swamps.
Okay.
That's where he would escape. Now, that's where he would escape. He would operate. He would go to the swamps to hide out from the British, and they would try to chase him. Now, in the movie The Patriot, if you'll notice, they tried to follow him into the swamps, and the people that followed him, the soldiers that followed him, would get lost, eaten by alligators. And so what the motto of this is: stay out of the swamps. Okay, next slide to see what we got here. I've lost track of myself. Yeah, there's Francis. But he was a very small man, thin, but tough as nails. And he got wounded from time to time. He fought from his horse, and he'd get wounded, have to recover, and the British would think that they were they were done with him forever. Now, the stories of revenge and neighbor against neighbor are countless. Now, I don't want to offend anyone with this next paragraph or so, or the next couple. But one such report reveals that a man named Thomas Brown came from England to become the king's Indian agent. His mission was to encourage the Indians to join the king's cause. He became very wealthy. He dressed in luxurious clothes. Brown, who took the loyalist side in a bold fashion, was well known and hated by the Patriots. He was ruthless. He was ruthless in battle, capturing on one occasion more than 20 of our boys and executing 8 of them. He turned the remaining dozen Patriots over to Indians for torture and for killing. Next slide. This is artwork that I found that I thought I'd never be able to find it, of Thomas Brown. Thomas Brown. The Patriots later captured Thomas Brown. They hated him with a passion. The Backwoods Boys hated him. They took him out and they tarred and feathered him, and they put him into a fire. They were going to burn him to death. But saner heads came and said, no, let's not do that. So he was removed from the fire. He would be scarred for life. And as a matter of fact, he lost 2 toes, and thereafter would be known as Burnfoot Brown.
Wow.
And after the war, he was exiled to St. Vincent's Island, where he died in 1825, never to return to the United States, all the while denying he committed any cruelty whatsoever. He would be one of the 3 men that would be exiled from our country and lose their citizenship and all their property be confiscated. The second one was Fanning, David Fanning, the most hated man. The most.
Now, you said he lost his citizenship, huh?
Of course. He lost his land, he lost his property, but 3 men, the Congress took away everything they owned, their citizenship, and they said they were going to exile them, but they left on their own because the citizens were going to hang them from the highest tree.
I made that as a point because of what's going on today, but that just shows that the Patriots back then were willing to remove someone's you get what I'm saying?
I hadn't made that connection.
Their citizenship because they did not have an allegiance to this country. That is so important.
Well, this is a story of revenge on the part of the Patriots, on the part of a man that captured and saw to it that 8 or 9 of our boys they gave them to the Indians. He knew the Indians would hang them, and they hanged them, and they tortured the rest. Brown took the loyalist cause in a bold way. He dressed in very expensive clothing. Every time you would see him, he was in expensive clothing. But they tarred and feathered him, and they sent him away, and eventually our country got rid of him. David Fanning. Let's go to our slide. David Fanning, probably the meanest, most hated American. Now, we might come up with some that are meaner. He was born in 1755. He probably was born a year or 2 before Abel was. He was born in Amelia County, Virginia. He was raised an orphan in Johnston County because there was a farmer that lived near Abel's farm. Dad somehow or another found out about him, felt sorry for him, and adopted him and took him to Johnston County. He turned, and I mentioned this before, he turned on his people because he got robbed. He organized about 900 farmers to fight as loyalists. So he was obviously very charismatic, and he actually formed uniforms for them, which you will not hear about, except in one like 10-second clip in the special done by public broadcasting. It says that there were units that fought, organized and fought the Patriots, and a man is shown in a black uniform with a black hat, and the hunting frock is black with cuffs made of red. That was his uniform for his men. They dyed the shirts black and red with red trim. All his property was confiscated, as I've said, citizenship taken away. He was refused land grants of any type. He fled to the West Indies first after the war. Then he went to Nova Scotia because they didn't want him in the West Indies. Went to Nova Scotia. I guess he could live comfortably up there as a Canadian. But not long after he got there, he was arrested for rape. So he had a mean streak in him. He raped a 15-year-old girl, was sentenced to death. However, he protested and resisted, and the charge was reduced, and he moved out of that country to an adjacent province in Canada. He was forever. And the next slide is a depiction of David Fanning. Typically, and this was the one that was used well after the Revolution, probably in the 100th celebration of the founding of our country. David Fanning always fleeing the noose on a horse. This became a very popular thing to have.
A fleeing Fanning.
Right. And he was a despicable character in appearance, and he was a miserable guy in real life. He was known for his awful scalp condition that oozed pus and stunk. His condition was called skull scalp. He would not visit in a home to dine with anyone, nor would he sleep near his soldiers, or his soldiers would not sleep near him because he stunk. And his appearance was awful, of course. He usually slept outside, and not worse, but he wore a silk stocking to cover the pus, the rotting scalp, and dropping skin and hair. And he probably had a hand in killing the boys at Piney Bottom. And there is a footnote that I found in this book by Mr. Hare, Dr. Hare, that late in life he found someone that cured his scalp. Wow. He didn't get any hair back, but at least it quit oozing pus.
Probably one of those infomercials on TV.
Probably one of those commercials on TV. So there you have. What about the boys? Now we're going to get into real history here now. Next slide. What about the boys that were called scumbags? They were called arrogant. You know, I've listed some of the things that the gentry call these boys. And this is a picture here. This is a side note. This is a picture here that I took in Ohio, seeking one of the graves of Sandra's ancestor on her dad's side, because her mother came from England, but her dad came from Ohio, and a lot of patriots in the Revolution down there on that side. So we went down to the Troutman Cemetery. It sounded like a fish. And these men showed up. They're an honor guard that's active in that area, and they show up at all markings. and they looked exactly the role, in my opinion, of scumbags, scoundrels. And a side note for this, they are so dedicated to what they do and their ancestors that they hand stitch their uniforms. No uniform has any type of mechanized equipment that helps make the uniform. And there are groups like this all over the United States, and they meet from time to time and have contests as to who has the best stitched jacket, shirt, coat. And so they're dedicated to the cause of their ancestors. Next slide.
And these are the deplorables, right, Larry?
These are the deplorables.
It sounds familiar.
Now, this is a piece of artwork that I found from a mountain man. I found several pieces of artwork being done by a young artist. He was young at that time.
That's great.
Lived in the mountains of North Carolina. And I ran into it quite by accident. And I purchased this and some other pictures I have here. But this depicts the women, our ancestors. According to author John Buchanan, Dr. Author John Buchanan of East Carolina University, which has written wonderful books, he says, their leaders said that they were belligerent, loyal, bigoted, valiant, crude, and tough. The men drank hard, fought hard, and moved often. The young women that came to this country, and when they came ashore it's interesting, when they came ashore in Wilmington, there seemed to be always a group of preachers down there. I guess they wanted to convert these young women that were stepping off the ship from basically Northern Ireland. Now, this is a quote. The young women shocked the sensitivities with their public displays of bosoms and legs. Methodist preacher reported they draw their shift, meaning their dress, they draw their shift tight to their body to show the roundness of their breasts. Now, what is a Methodist minister doing looking at anything like that?
That's why they were there.
The Baptist preacher added, as he gazed from the dock, they are well shaped and they raise their petticoats to show the fineness of their limbs. An Anglican clergyman, or stepping on my toes now, an Anglican clergyman said, they are the scum of the earth, ignorant, mean, and worthless. That sounds like an Anglican. He went on to say, they are white savages. And worst of all, they are Irish Presbyterians. True is, they were American Patriots. They were our forefathers, our foremothers. Those women they would come to display more than shapy bodies. They would come to display their muskets at their cabin door, displaying muskets at their door to protect their children, to protect their homes, and to defend it while their husbands were away fighting for independence.
Sounds like the women of today, too, doesn't it?
Huh?
A real patriot woman that kind of fits right in, doesn't it?
A patriot woman. And this drawing that I found, it just touched my heart because I've got a story of my great-great-grandmother that you've never heard about that sets the heart of any patriot on fire. Now, moving along.
We'll do an episode on that in the future, Larry.
Oh, my gosh,
Absolutely.
yes.
Absolutely. Eleanor Wilson is her name. Now, who is this man, George Hanger? Go on to the next. Stay there. He was a British major. He was a deputy. And he recorded certain things about these fighting boys. Now, notice his fancy uniform. Tarleton had one just like that. Major George Hanger, Tarleton's deputy, wrote on the tactical problems faced by the British. This is a quote from his diary. The crackers and the militia in those parts of America are all mounted on horseback, which renders it totally impossible to force them to any engagement with the infantry only. When they choose to fight, they dismount, fasten their horses to fences and rails. But if not very confident in their superiority in number, they remain on horseback and give fire, and they retreat, which renders it useless to attack them without a cavalry. For though you repulse them and you drive them from the field, you can never improve the advantage. You can never do them any material detriment.
Really?
Another problem the British had was the Tory mounted militia. And we're switching gears now. We're talking about the enemy. The problem the British had was the Tories that mounted and tried to fight. They were inferior to the rebel. They were inferior to the rebel hosts, they call it here, H-O-S-E, horse. However, the British cavalry was another story, and thus the hit and run strategy of these crackers and militia. So if they engaged cavalry, hit and run, leave the field. The rebel backwoods boys were schooled in Indian fighting, since the Indian Wars had gone on for years, according to a grievance, a communique to General Washington. And this is a communique that was sent to General Washington by a British general, complaining. These militiamen do not fight like Christian gentlemen. They possess a different type of leadership qualities suited for the back country. Each man is independent in his own right, having to fend for himself, and in the wilderness make his own decisions. Make his own decisions in a split second without the benefit of war councils, which if time was taken for these backwoodsmen to have a war council, they'd be dead. Tories were not schooled and experienced in this way of thinking. Patriot rebels were leaders, and those who rode with them experts in weapons, horses, and the rough life in the field. Nathaniel Greene, not a big supporter of the militia in the beginning, came to say this about their service in the army. There is a great spirit of enterprise among these back people, and those that come out as volunteers are a little formidable to the enemy. Guess what? They are bold and they're daring, especially under Commanders Sumter, Marion, Shelby, and Clark. And this is according to Greene. That gentleman is another story in itself. You can go on to the next slide. And this is where the complaint came to General Washington. Your people don't fight like gentlemen. They fight from behind trees and rocks and whatever. Next slide.
Incredible.
These are the Backwoods Boys commanders, worth our attention in study of biographers and their strategies. There is Sumter, there's a town in South Carolina named Sumter, Elijah Clark, from North Carolina, I believe, and then there is Isaac Shelby, for which Shelby, North Carolina, is named. They were fierce warriors, could not be defeated in the field by the British. The Backwoods Boys were known by different names. Shelby's riders, now take all this down so you'll know the difference now.
I gotcha.
Shelby's riders in and around Shelby, North Carolina, were known as the over-the-mountain men. And the British soldiers called them the backwater men. Cornwallis called them in the coastal plains in Piedmont the backwoodsmen. Many from Virginia, the Virginia mountains, the Shenandoah Valley in Kentucky, were crack shots and named for Morgan's rifles. And most of them were simply called the Virginia Rifles. So now there, folks, you've got the distinction, so you can teach your children the difference between the various groups that fought. And I would imagine that their titles came from the way that the enemy, your enemy most of the time names you. You know that, don't you?
Right.
Your enemy will give you your name. The problem King George and Lord Cornwallis was, the boys do not concede the back country. Are we understanding this now?
Yep.
Do we have an election coming up now?
Oh, yes.
I don't want to enter into modern politics.
It has a lot to do with what happened then, Larry. I mean, we're the same people. A lot of us, that 3% of us, okay, which is pretty much then too, is what makes this whole thing go.
But our forefathers would not concede the back country. They gave up the cities, Charleston. They gave up the city, Wilmington. The British controlled places like Charleston, Wilmington, Augusta, Savannah, and Camden.
The cities.
But not the countryside. The boys controlled most everything from the foot of the Blue Ridge Mountains to the flatlands of the South and North Carolina and North Georgia. In the Piedmont region, Mecklenburg County, this was known as the Hornet's Nest. And thus they have a hornet's nest on their county symbol, and the city has one on their official seal, and not one politician can tell you why there's a hornet's nest on their seals, because they don't know history, but it's there. The Tories were a nuisance and deadly, but following Moore's Creek, now this goes back to the beginning of the war, following Moore's Creek, the first battle, and then Ramseur's Mill, which we don't study very much, and King's Mountain, which is studied, the enemy, the supporters of the king, were not prone to come out after those battles. Though the Fanning crowd, we know Fanning, don't we? He continued to resist. But it was harder for him to recruit Tories after this. But he continued to try to fight. And with less men, he fought with greater, what shall we say, awfulness. While General Washington and Greene wanted the Backwoods Boys to fight like Continental soldiers, General Charles Lee, we can see if we've got another slide here. General Charles Lee, that had come from England, was a cavalry officer. Now get this, he was a cavalry officer, English, but he saw this when he got here. He wanted the war to be fought by the militia units operating like guerrillas, like he had seen fight in the backwoods country, which visited horrors on the opponents. The picture in the British officer's mind of the way to conduct a war is men marching shoulder to shoulder with gleaming bayonets and scarlet red formations, masked in blind obedience. The Backwoods Boys presented something else, a shadowy, hawk-eyed American in buckskin or a ragged hunting shirt behind a fence or a tree, picking off redcoats one by one. Captain Moffett, Patriot militia leader, wrote the following. There was that shadowy, hawk-eyed American in buckskin. Yeah. Moffett, Patriot militia leader, wrote the following. Now, this is a quote, folks. You need to take this down where you got my document here. Quote, facts are that the Backwoods Boys were on their own footing. Nothing was furnished us from the public. We furnished our own clothes, which were composed of rough material, all homespun. Our overdress was a hunting shirt, Okay? That
Mm-hmm.
was for wintertime. That was for the fall. That was for going into battle. Was a hunting shirt. And what we called, made out of linsey woolsey, or cotton. Wool was belted around us, so they could have been made out of wool. We furnished our own horses, our own saddles, our own bridles, our guns, our swords, our butcher knives, our own spurs. We got our powder and lead as we could, and often had to apply to the women of the neighborhood, or not neighborhood, country, for their old pewter and dishes and spoons to supply the place of lead. And if we had lead, hold up a second. And if we had lead, we would be in good shape. If we had, we would make sufficient balls as needed, half lead, half pewter. We felt very supplied. Swords at first were scarce, but we had several good blacksmiths among us. Besides, there were several in the countryside. If we got hold of a piece of good steel, we'd just keep it, and likewise would take it along with an old whipsaw and every whipsaw we could find, and we'd set 2 or 3 blacksmiths to work at one shop and make the steel we had brought in. In this way, we pretty soon had a good supply of swords, butcher knives, mostly all of our spurs, our bridles, our horsemen's capes, manufactured by us. We carried no camp equipage, not cooking utensils, not anything to encumber us. We depended on what chance of kind providence might cast our way, and we always were ready to decamp in short notice, end quote. Now, that is a quote from a guy that was there. Now, how many of those have you ever read in a history book? I haven't.
Never.
None.
And I have to say something, Larry. This this actually, it blows my mind because the story you're telling about America right now, and people need to know this 250 years later, is these people gave their all. They brought all their own stuff. A lot of people aren't going to, well, I'll do that if you hand me this or give me that. We're talking about real Americans that are putting everything that they have on the line, worked together as a team, and did everything that they could by the grace of God to do this. And we
And there's
take for
and
granted what our forefathers actually, it kind of brings tears to your eyes that they put all, like, their everything in it. It was, your shirt said it at the beginning, give me
Right.
liberty or give me death. And there was no in between.
there's something else that this depicts is the rugged individualism of
Yes.
the patriots, the people in this country, to do what you have to do to make do with what you got, and get done what you need to get done. It's a freedom, independence, individualism that is solid, upon which you build that teamwork that you just mentioned through
We need that back.
patriotism and common goal and objective. This is a very inspiring story.
We need that back. Folks, we need that kind of rugged individual, that Christ God centered freedom that we were granted by our Creator, and we're willing to do anything and everything to protect that. And we need to do that and keep doing that as we move forward. Larry, this is so inspiring. Thank you.
Yeah,
Well,
please continue.
Well, I'm honored that after 12 years, someone would want to see it.
We are honored, more than
And,
you could possibly know.
Well, obviously to say, the Backwoods Boys, whatever title they had, they weren't interested in camp work, okay? They weren't interested in polishing your boots or your belt buckles or whatever. They weren't interested in marching. They weren't interested in drilling. They weren't interested in training, as was required in the Continental Army. They did not want to enlist for 2 or 3 years since they had crops and family, women folk at home, and kids back home to look after. They were dedicated to their families as they were to the glorious cause. And that's something else to be taught, is their dedication to their family, especially this day and time, especially men.
Yeah.
However, they did not want the king who ruled from far away, but they had put up with this in the past. They had put up with little British law, and that's what had the armies of the English had come south, and they had brought law with them. Now with the British army marching through the countryside and emboldening the king's men, such as Fanning, to fight patriots, and the times were different, the Backwoods Boys were now threatened by their neighbors, the Tories, the Loyalists, the Highlanders. Also, there was the ongoing Indian attacks, which we haven't even talked about, massacres, wanton killings in homes and their crops, and killed in their crops and in their fields by the likes of Chief Rabin, Dragon Canoe, Little Carpenter, Alanostodi, and Atakakula Kula, and the notorious Queen Esther. Next slide. And there they are. Those were the chiefs. You will not find them pictured in Ken Burns' special, because I've watched it. You find the ones that were friendly to us and told us how we ought to go about forming our country, and these did not. Chief Rabin, Dragon Canoe. Have any of you read about? Some of you may know about these. You're backwoodsman yourself. Little Carpenter, No Stodi, Atakakula Kula, all were British allies. And then there was the notorious Queen. The British had an Indian woman that was friendly to her because her husband had been friendly to her. And her husband had gotten killed, and she was absolutely in a state of total revenge. Queen Esther, she personally bashed in the skulls of 14 tied and bound Patriot soldiers at a site known as Bloody Rock. She placed the men in a circle on a large rock, harassed them, and used her tomahawk to maul them as she danced and berated them in their last moments. She hated Yankees and reported the next day that she could hardly move. She was so tired. She carried the scalps with her of 225 men, women, children that she took on a single day, July the 3rd, 1778, mostly old men and boys who had been left at home while the younger men were fighting in the army. Esther had acquired the leadership of her dead husband's tribe, and that's where the British came about and called her a queen. With the British beachhead in Charleston and Wilmington, the English were offering freedom to slaves for joining the king's cause, and bounties for capturing and bringing American soldiers in, even deserters, and in some case, bounties for scalp. The accumulation of all these things was too much for Americans to tolerate.
Sounds a lot like today.
I don't know what you're going to do with that history. Maybe it troubles your sensitivity. Next slide.
What happened?
The Johnston County And Cumberland County boys, I haven't talked about them individually because it's personally my family. Basically, they rode with Colonel Ebenezer Folsom, the militia commander who lived near Bowie's Creek. And that's where I went to my first college. Campbell University is at Bowie's Creek. As a matter of fact, I researched and found out that Abel's first land grant is the place that Campbell University sits. And I took all of this information in to the previous president of the university, and he showed about as much interest as my dog Rover when Rover is looking out the window at a ham steak of some type. He was totally uninterested that his university sat on the land that a patriot had previously owned.
So and Larry, right here, you said Abel Johnston, okay, and let people know exactly who Abel is right here.
Abel's daddy, Amos. I know Amos was at the first battle in North Carolina down in Johnston County, Moores Creek. Jacob Matthews and Hardy Matthews, which I grew up with their great-great-great-grandchildren. They were brothers and brothers-in-law. They married my aunts. Then there was Barney Johnson, a character. He was a character. He was Ann's brother. And then there was a guy named Reuben Barber who claims he was at the wedding of Abel and Ann, but the judges wouldn't believe him. And then there was Israel Folsom, Ebenezer Folsom's son, the colonel's son. And then there was the youngest baby brother of Abel, and this was Willie. Colonel Folsom had come as a youth to North Carolina from Connecticut, even opening a tavern, which became the town of Lillington, the county seat of Harnett County. That's where I grew up. He was a fierce patriot and brought justice to Tories. That is in there because he probably led in the hanging of the Scots. He led Cumberland Johnson County militia at Moores Creek. He was not the commanding officer, but he led the boys from our counties. And that battle took place on the 27th of February, 1776, where Tories and Highlanders were soundly defeated on no uncertain terms. Ebenezer, for his work in this, was granted £500 by the State Council of Safety. And after that, he ran for office and he became a senator in North Carolina. But he soon gave it up to fight. He became the man that moved out west, and some of his family started a prison called Folsom Prison. He was a correspondent. Anyway. He received all of these accolades from Samuel Johnston of Edenton, who came from my home country, family's home country, which was in the British Isles. And Johnston saw to it that he got £500, and I have seen a copy of that chip in a book put together by the Daughters of the American Revolution. So, in 84 and 87, Abel received additional land from governors and generals Alexander Martin, who he fought under, Richard Caswell, who became the governor and was the leading commanding officer at the first battle down at Moores Creek. Caswell, a lawyer, commanded the fight. He wrote the North Carolina Constitution. Here's the two governors. and generals, Caswell and Alexander Martin. There we go. And you can continue on. And these are, you can't see it. This, you'd have to blow this really up. But these.
This is the land grant that went to your great, great, great grandfather.
And this is a land grant signed by his commanding officer and governor,
Caswell.
Richard Caswell.
You can see it.
And if you could see it, you would see scribbled in this Abel's name.
Yep.
And of course, of all the information that locate the land. Next.
Abel Johnston.
Yep. Abel Johnston. Abel's land grant came from Governor Alexander Martin, also, who he fought under and became governor. Keep in mind that governorships were 1 year in North Carolina and remained that way until about 1835 or 38.
1 year.
You just served as governor for 1 year and you went away. Now we know that Abel moved back from his land grants that he received over in the Cumberland County area, and that is near where we know that the Swamp Fox fought. He moved from there back to Johnston County. We know he moved because in 1790, the next slide, in 1790, here is his name in the first census.
Wow.
That he was back in Johnston County, living at the Middle Creek.
Wow.
Next slide. And here is
Wow.
a copy of Abel's last paycheck that he received after the war. And this tells me he was on duty in South Carolina until the Army was dismissed at the end of the war. And that would have been, the date for that would have been about what? About the time that the peace treaty was signed with England. And so when he came home, next slide.
Well, let me ask a question here, Larry, because this is really fascinating that you have this. Now, in some places we have Abel Johnston, and on this one, he's got 2 L's in it and Johnson. There's a little story behind that, isn't there?
Well, there's some story, but I don't know it. It could well be that he brought the chits back.
Right?
Gave them to his wife. She could have signed them on his behalf, take them to the local military district, which was in Wilmington, a long ways off. In those days was a long ways.
It's fascinating.
20 miles. I don't know.
That's fascinating now.
That's the way it's spelled. Now, Abel's friends, he told his friends that after he got back home, he didn't get a train ride home. He didn't get a plane ride home. He didn't get a chit to go home. He saddled up his horse and he went home from South Carolina. And that's about a 10-day trip or more, all the way home from Charleston. Probably that's a 12 or 15-day trip. And he went home and he arrived at this creek, which bordered his property. This is Middle Creek, the boundary of his Johnston County farm. And it's very near Smith Creek, which is now Smithville, North Carolina. Abel told his friends, they told him, he says, Ann's waiting. And this is quoted by some of his old soldiers that were already home when they greeted him. They told him to go on in and go in. And he said that he was not going in to meet his precious Ann in his dirty situation. They quoted that. I love that. I'm not going to greet you in my dirty situation. And here
That's a gentleman.
He bathed in that creek.
What respect?
He bathed in that very creek. And that's that I took that picture when I went down there. Also, there is a tobacco field. This is a tobacco field. That was a part of Abel's plantation, and I worked that field as a boy, as tobacco, and pulling tobacco, burning tobacco, getting dirty, getting wax all over you. And now his great-grandsons went to his home and they went to the creek where he returned after the war was over. He got his last paycheck, of course, and he did get some other pay, maybe 80 to 100 pounds. But this was his last one that the historian actually pulled from the records and gave to me begrudgingly, because they had to copy it in a copy machine.
Wow.
Yeah, and I was sorry about that. What about Abel Johnston? He began his service at age 19, we think. He could have been younger, but I think he was about 19, and he concluded his service to his country at a battle-hardened American at age 27. He and Ann would settle on their farm and raise tobacco, grow cotton, and have a family. They had 9 children, to which 8 lived. The first died during Abel's first year of fighting in about 1777. As a free citizen, Abel would serve on various county commissions to locate and build roads, grist mills. His brother-in-law would go into the business of grist mills, and I have been in those grist mills, and they are still working today. His farms would succeed, and he would leave Anne a substantial property. He died in 1820. She lived to 1838, exactly 100 years before I was born. As a matter of fact, when I was a child, I was held by my great-grandmother, who was Anne's grandchild. So, we should never forget the hardships, and that's the whole purpose of this presentation, to understand what our forefathers, and this is just one family. This is the Johnson family. But there are thousands of other families that the history is just out there waiting to be discovered and to be passed on to our children. The Backwoods Boys had shown they could play a critical role in defeating the world's greatest military power and in the history of the world. Now these men would become the backbone of a new, free, and independent nation. In the South, many young men, the sons of these savages, scum, and beggars, would become successful farmers, businessmen, leaders, founders of industry, towns, schools, universities. Thousands would move west to claim land grants given to them for fighting in the American Revolution. They would clear farmland, they would build industries, and they would conquer the western frontier. The Backwoods Boys made a difference, and the last sweet revenge would be theirs as their children stepped onto the world stage to make the United States the greatest republic the world has ever known, and made possible because now men were free, women were free. What's more, all this provided for in a document that they saw to was written, and that is the United States Constitution of America. I finish with this Latin phrase. I'm not a Latin scholar, but I finish with this phrase. There is a Latin phrase that sums up the Backwoods Boys, their contribution to the attaining of American independence. Sine qua non, which is translated without which not. Thank you, gentlemen, for being patient.
Thank you, Larry. That was wonderful. And that all fits into Mountain Patriots has one of its 7 ministries as the constitutional ministry. And that's what all of this family history and patriotism is all about, is that Constitution that came out of all of this personal effort, personal sacrifice, and built this great nation.
Well, you're absolutely right. I cannot add a single thing to what you said. Not one syllable. And I hope that this, what we have recorded today, can be circulated and used, and will contribute to the fertilizing with blood, sweat, and tears the tree of liberty.
Yes. I'm all for the sweat and tears. I'm not so sure about the blood right now.
I just encourage everyone to look back at your history, find out what happened. Mountain Patriots Educational Ministries wants to bring this kind of content so that people really appreciate, like both of these gentlemen are talking about, the blood, the sweat, and the tears that went into the growth and freedom that we're very close to losing, that we are going to regain again.
Amen to that.
Amen.
Yes.
Charlie, would you like to take us out with that? No, I would rather. Larry, would you like to take us out with a prayer?
Yes, please.
Please.
Our Father, we're grateful for the gathering of these two men in this room with yours truly. We lift up to you the very foundation that our feet rest upon, the foundation of liberty, life, happiness, the foundation that's taken for granted, the foundation upon which men and women have stood for 250 years and further to defend this nation. And over 1 million, more than 1 million Americans have given their lives in order to carry forward what our forefathers began. We are grateful for the 250,000 men and women that joined George Washington, Nathaniel Greene, and all of the officers, the men in the trenches that joined in this fight. We are grateful for what we know is 25,000 of these soldiers died in the American Revolution. Unknown to many. And so, Lord, we lift up to you the children of this land that live this day, the parents that are given responsibilities for governing our children and raising them. And Lord, I pray that this effort this morning can make a contribution to the strengthening of the foundation of every children and parent and adult that will take time to watch. Bless the men that have been here this morning to stand by this, to be a part of it, to direct the technical, to give guidance to yours truly for presentation. And now as we go into the rest of this day, we lift up to you our lives, our hopes, and our aspirations, and ask Jesus Christ that you would anoint every thought we have and everything that we do. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen.
Wow. Gentlemen, I want to thank you both. Have a very great Easter, because that's what's coming up. What a perfect time to do this. And as Charlie and I always say at the end of every presentation, this one
is in the book.
Have a blessed day.